All right, Rabbi, say good morning. My apologies for the delay. And Merit Hashem, I'll record Mishnah Brura. Mishnah Brura, Mesilas Yesharim, a little bit later on this morning. But say, let's begin with the daf. We have an incredibly beautiful and magnificent daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsor, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Yanki and Eliza Statman, and Yitzi and Rebecca Statman, in commemoration of the first yard site of their sister Menucha Shendel Yehudis Zichrono Lebracha Bas David Yosef, Shmuel Rabin Karabkin, for dedicating the shiurim this month in commemoration of the 25th yard site of Rabin's mother, Melanie Solomon, Pesa Mira Bas Chaim Zichrono Lebracha. Our week of learning sponsors, Zevi and Shoshi Daniel, Le'ilu Nishmas Rafael Yaakov Ben Avram Zichrono Lebracha, and our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Maish and Devorah Werdersheim, in honor of Richard Noodleman for his chesed. He knows what it's about. Good, fantastic, excellent. Well, so with that, let us begin. Beautiful daf ahead of us today. A lot to do today. Today's daf is Daf Yud. Daf Yud. And we are picking up, I will say, on the bottom of Tes Amud Beis. Let's pick up 2, 4, 6, 8 lines up from the bottom. We actually got a little bit further, but let's pick up here. Maskef la Rabbi Mani. So we'll say yesterday we saw the dramatic story of Shimon HaTzadik, who would never go ahead and eat the Asham Tameh. Right? If a Nazir had become Tameh and then he had to restart his Nazirus, so Shimon HaTzadik would never go ahead and consume such an Asham. So Rabbi Mani says, why not? In other words, why an Asham? Why not an Asham Tameh? So the Gemara says, the Asi al Chet, because such an asham is brought for a sin, and apparently, again, Shimon HaTzadik didn't want to consume a carbon that was brought for a sin. Says the Gemara, well, that's kind of what an asham is. If that's the case, then why is Shimon HaTzadik focusing on the asham of a nazir? Asham in general comes because of a chet, so he shouldn't consume any asham. Here is the reason of Shimon HaTzadik. I will say I read this quickly yesterday, so let's just read it again. Kishahin toin nozrin. This is an incredible yisod. When would a person become a Nazir? When he was going through a rough patch in life. Again, something's going on that requires him to take dramatic action. I will say sometimes the Rambam writes this in Hilchos Deis, that sometimes when a person is struggling with something, the way to affect change is to move your life to an extreme. And then the idea is, now it's never good to live in extremes, but sometimes you have to make extreme dramatic shift so that over time the pendulum could swing back towards the middle. So what's a Nazir? A Nazir is a person who has to affect change in his life. And for whatever the reason, he feels that the only way to affect that change is to do something overwhelmingly drastic and dramatic. So he becomes a Nazir. He becomes a Nazir. What happens? So remember again, Stam Nazirus, a regular Nazirite vow lasts for how long? Again, we'll see this in the Gemara, 30 days. So the person says, you know what? 30 days, kind of like a diet, right? 30 days, I could do this. 30 days, I can handle this, right? I can make this occur. Then what happens? Well, Kishem Tamin, here's the problem. When Nazir becomes Tameh, Rabbi say, what occurs? The clock restarts. So suddenly the Gemara says, Kishem Tamin, Rabin Alei, Yemei Naziros. Now I become Tameh. The clock restarts. Mischarotin Bahen. Now suddenly he has Charata. And I will say, technically speaking, and what happens? V'nimtzu mevi'in chulin la'azara. And because he has charata, he never wanted to be a Nazir. He regrets ever having become a Nazir. And it turns out that when he brings the asham, because I will say charata is one of the ways in which one could undo a neder. So it turns out that the animal that he's bringing as a carbon is not really a carbon. Rather, again, it's chulin. It's an unconsecrated animal that's being brought to slaughter in the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Ran says, don't get excited. This isn't literal. In other words, again, he has charata, it's true, but that charata doesn't have the ability to undo the neder naziros. Shimon HaTzadik essentially wouldn't consume this carbon because he felt it was like chulin la'azara. It, of course, is not chulin la'azara. It's not bringing an unconsecrated animal into the Beis HaMikdash, but it feels like it's such a situation. Shimon HaTzadik didn't want to eat a asham, didn't want to eat from a carbon from which he felt the owners may have had remorse about ever having entered into this process. That's why he would not eat the asham of a Nazir Tameh, because this was a guy who perhaps again would have had remorse ever having entered into this situation to begin with. And therefore Shimon HaTzadik says, you know what? I don't want to eat his carbon. If that's the case, the Gemara says, Yachi, afilu nazir tar, nami. If that's the case, I don't understand. Why can't you make that argument about any Nazir? Guy becomes a Nazir. So you both say, remember, there's an incredible musr in this. The incredible musr in this is, as I just mentioned before, which is that sometimes in life, as much as in general, we do not like to operate in extremes. We do not like to behave in extremes. It's always good, like the Rambam says, to find that derech hamamutza, to find that middle path in life. But it's important to understand that sometimes, you do have to affect dramatic change. It happens that in life, dramatic change has to be affected. Sometimes you have to swing the pendulum with the goal of coming back somewhere in the middle. So the Gemara says, 1 second, if Shimon HaTzadik is concerned that maybe the Nazir is going to regret ever having become a Nazir, why does that only apply? And therefore, again, it's like Chulin Ba'azara, like unconsecrated Beis HaMikdash. Why does that only apply to a Nazir who became Tameh? Why doesn't that concern come up with who? With who? With every Nazir. To which the Gemara says something very interesting. To which the Gemara says, Da'amude amid nafshe diyachal lindar. No, the truth is, because when a person undertakes a stam nazirus, they know it's 30 days. I could assess myself. Could I handle that? Can't I handle that? The problem only comes up with the Nazir Tameh, because again, he has to restart the clock. That's where things become a bit more complicated. But in the Stam Neder Nazirus, a person assesses themselves, knows what they're capable of, which I will say also another incredible yesod, how in life, a person has to be realistic about where they're holding, right? A person has to be realistic about what they're capable of. And sometimes when setting your spiritual goals for yourself, it only makes sense to do so with an acute sense of self-awareness. Because sometimes in life we set goals for ourselves that either are lack ambition or are just out of reach. If you lack ambition, that's not good, right? Because then again, I'm setting the bar too low. But sometimes again, if a person sets goals that are simply out of reach, that means I'm not self-aware enough. I'm not in touch enough with who I am. So you see like this interesting, so to become a Nazir for 30 days, you can handle that. Become Tameh, start again. A lot of times a person says, whoa, I didn't sign up for this. And that's where Shimon HaTzadik had his concern. I will say the other possibility is, top of Yud, Afilu Tim Rabbi Huda. Now I will say, remember again, going back to yesterday's daf, such good Gemara today ahead of us. Going back to yesterday's daf for just a moment. Sorry. Good. Going back to yesterday's daf for just a moment. So remember again, the Gemara wanted to suggest, right? Our Mishnah said, a person makes a neder, for example, Kinidre Risha, little review, Kinidre Rishaim Hareini, and there's a Nazir walking by. What's the halacha? You're a Nazir. What happens if a person says, Kinidre Kisherim Hareini? What's the halacha? Nothing. However, what if a person says, Kinidvos Kisherim Hareini? It works, right? So we're trying to figure out what's this distinction between Nedarim and Nedava. Neder and Nedava. The Gemara quoted a machlokes on the bottom of Tesla and the Aleph between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda, right? About the nature of a vow in general, right? Rabbi Meir said ultimately the best thing is don't make any vows. Rabbi Huda said the best thing is to do is what? Make a vow and what? Fulfill it. Either way, the Gemara is saying neither of them make a distinction between Nedarim and Nedava. So whose opinion is reflected in our Mishnah? So now the Gemara says, first line on Yom Adal 10a. The truth is the Gemara could even reflect the view, our Mishnah, could even reflect the view of Rabbi Huda. Rabbi Huda made no distinction between Neder and Nedava. Kem Rabbi Huda ben Nedava. When Rabbi Huda said that it's better to go ahead and make a Neder and fulfill it, he wasn't talking about Neder. What was he talking about? Nedava. The Gemara says, but 1 second. So the Gemara says, I'm Rabbi Huda ben Nedava. So the Gemara says, "V'haktani tov mizeh umizeh no dermakayim." But that's not what the Brisa said, right? The Brisa said that Rabbi Huda's lashon was tov mizeh umizeh, better than making a neder and not fulfilling it, or better than making a neder, right, or not making a neder is ultimately making a neder and fulfilling it. He says neder. So the Gemara says, "Maishna noder delo." I'm sorry, Tani no Dave Makayim. Okay, change it, easy enough, right? In other words, he doesn't mean to say no there, he means to say no there. He means to say the best thing you could do is making a dava and ultimately fulfill it. So Gemara says, Maishna no der delo. So let's analyze this, so we'll say. In other words, so now you have Rabbi Huda, according to this version, you have Rabbi Huda saying that it is a virtuous and pious thing to make a nedava, and fulfill it. But yet, it doesn't apply to neder. In other words, don't make a neder, even if you're going to fulfill it, but to obligate yourself in a nedava, that's beautiful and virtuous. To which the Gemara says, what's the distinction between a neder and a nedava? Ma'ishna noder delo, dilma asi ba lidei takala. We'll say it goes back to yesterday's daf as well. What's the concern? The concern is that you may come to a stumbling block with a neder. Now we'll say, what's the assumed stumbling block one will potentially encounter with a neder? What's the potential stumbling block? Bal ta'acher. Delay in fulfillment of the neder. Well, the Gemara says, remember, nedava nami dilma asili de takala. But one second, nedava, it could also happen, right? It could also happen with nedava that you could come to a stumbling block, right? The same thing could happen, because remember, I both say, as I pointed out to you yesterday, so nedava is a form of neder. So, which means that if a person obligates themselves in a gift offering of a nedava, that's also subject to Baal Ta'acher. To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda Latame, so supposed to listen to this. Rabbi Huda says there's a way to avoid. How so? Da'amar Adam maybe kivsaso liazara, umakdisha, v'somechala, v'shochta. So Rabbi Huda subscribes to the Hillel model, right? And the Hillel model was, don't consecrate an animal until you get to the Beis HaMikdash, thereby avoiding any potential issues of Me'ilah. So the Hillel model was, bring the unconsecrated animal to the Beis HaMikdash, consecrate it in the courtyard, du smicha, du shchita. And I both say, what the Gemara is suggesting is like this. That's called nedava. That's called nedava. Now I both say, so it turns out, and this is very interesting, that nedava doesn't mean a type of carbon. Rather, what does nedava mean? Nedava is descriptive of a type of process. The nedava process, so to speak, is one where one avoids additional potential halachic issues. How does one do that? Delay consecration until you get to the Beis HaMikdash. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, that's fine. Teinach nedava de karbanos. Nedava de neziros ma'ika lemeimar. So I both say, now you've defined nedava in a very narrow sacrificial manner. But what about the case of neziros? Because I both say, remember again, there's also a nedava by, right? There seems to be a nedava by neziros. What's the case of nedava by neziros? They both say, this is incredible. Get ready for this. Get ready for this. Rabbi Huda Latame. Rabbi Huda explains. Rabbi say, get ready. Tisanya. Rabbi Huda Omer. This is absolutely incredible. Hasidim harishonim hayu misavin lahavi karben chatas. It's wild. The early pious ones, the Hasidim harishonim, they yearned to bring a chatas. They yearned to bring a sin offering. What was the problem? But here's the problem. A minor issue. They never sinned. They both said, can you imagine having a problem like this in life? Right? All I want is to bring a chatas, but I have nothing to bring a chatas for. Now I will say, the truth is, to be fair, it doesn't mean they didn't sin. Right? Every single person sins. What it means is what? They never committed an aveira which warranted a chatos. Which, again, the truth is, remember, you bring a chatos if you unintentionally violate something that, had you done it intentionally, would have been a chi of misa or a chi of kares, death penalty or kares penalty. Okay, so they were vigilant in their behaviors, so they never did anything which would have warranted a chatos. But Rabbi said they felt deficient. I want to bring a chatos. I'm not getting to bring a chatos. So what would they do? This is incredible. By the lashon of Shena Kadosh Baruch Hu maybe takala al yedim is also an interesting lashon. We're going to come back in just a moment. Why? Because Hashem never brought about any stumbling block through them, which means they never sinned. Right? They remember again, as we saw before, chatos is one of those karbanos. You can't voluntarily choose to bring a chatos. Right? Chatos is only brought ultimately again if you're obligated. So what would they do? It's incredible. Mahayu os. What would they do? Omdin umisnad v'nezirus lamakom. Wow. What did the Rabbi say? So the Hasidim Harishonim, what they would do is they would become a Nazir. Why? Because when you become a Nazir, part of the sacrificial rite, when you go ahead and you complete your Neder Nazirus, is a Chatos and an Asham. Right? A Chatos. So that enabled them to go ahead and bring a sin offering. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Lo nadru bel nazir. No. That's not true. Rabbi Shimon says absolutely not. They wouldn't become a nazir. So what would they do? So now let's go through this. Ela harotza lahavi ola misnadevu mevi. If you want to bring in ola, you could bring in ola as an adava. Shlamim misnadevu mevi. Shlamim, you could also bring as an adava. Toda va'arba'a mine lachma. We'll say Toda is a Thanksgiving offering. So we'll say karbanos like a shlamim, right? Shlamim ultimately again is, well, let's work backwards. Ola is a carbon fully offered up on the mizbeach. Shlamim divided into three parts. One part goes to the owner, one part goes to the kohen, one part is consumed on the mizbeach. Those karbanos you could bring as voluntary offerings. Fine. Carbon Toda is a Thanksgiving offering, which means that if you are in a life-threatening situation and you were saved from that life-threatening situation, you bring a carbon toda. Just to give you the equivalent. So pretty much anything like for today that you would bench gomel, you would bring a carbon toda for that. Now, interestingly enough, a carbon toda could also be brought, misnadevu maybe. You could also, now carbon toda was unique, it was brought with 4 different types of loaves. You could also bring a carbon toda as an adava, which is interesting. But an incredible yisod on that. You know why you could bring a carbon nidava, a carbon toda as an nidava? Because you're always allowed to say thank you. You're always allowed to say thank you. There's no such thing as a person being prevented from expressing their thanks, their gratitude towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Aval b'nezirus, Rabbi say, remember again, this is Rabbi Shimon's model. Aval b'nezirus lo hisnadvu. But you can't become you shouldn't become a nazir. You shouldn't bring a carbon nazirus as an adava. Why? Kadei shelo yikru chotin. In order not to be called a sinner. Shene'emar v'chiper alav me'asher chata ala nefesh. Because the pasuk says it will be atoned for him because he has gone ahead and sinned regarding his soul. So I will say, fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, about an ability to become a nazir. Rabbi Yehuda seems to say, lechatchila, it's a beautiful thing. In fact, the Hasidim Arishonim, the early pious ones, when they weren't able to bring a chatas because they weren't liable, but they wanted to bring a chatas, what would they do? Become a voluntary nazir. I mean, you always become a voluntary nazir, right? Become a nazir. That enables you to bring a chatas. Rabbi Shimon says, 1 second, right? Let's pump the brakes on that. Don't become a nazir. You can bring every other sug, every other category of karbanos on your own as a voluntary offering. But do not become a nazir in order to bring a chatas. Why? Because a nazir is called a chote. A nazir is called a sinner. We're going to get into this in just a little bit. So I will say, I want to just point out, just to keep the flow over here, what the Gemara is pointing out, so what does it mean? The Gemara is suggesting now that our Mishnah, which speaks about the idea that if you say, kinidvos ksherim, or kinidavas ksherim, that works. That is a proper form, that is a proper yad. So what does it mean? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, and at least in karbanos, what it would mean is not a type of carbon, but how you bring your carbon. The Hillel method of delaying consecration of the carbon to get to the Beis HaMikdash. And what would it mean by Nazir? So we'll say, what's an example of a Nedava by Nazirus? A Nedava by Nazirus would be like this. A person who becomes a Nazir, why? Because he wants the ability to offer up a carbon chatas, because Baruch Hashem, incredibly, he has no other opportunity to bring this particular carbon. He's done no infraction which would warrant the carbon. Incredible. I will say just one word about this. It struck me that this lashon of Chasidim Harishon Misavin. So I will say the Chasidim they yearned to bring a carbon, a chatos. I will say, yeah, I understand you want to say, you know what, everybody has a bucket list, right? So some people, their bucket list is Taryag mitzvos. That's my bucket list. I want to do all 613. So again, no person could do all 613, but Lamais, again, that's the bucket list. So I understand what Paslashut of Misavin. They desired to bring a chatos. What does that mean? Perhaps what the Gemara is pointing out over here is sensitizing us to the power of tshuva. See, I will say, what did they want in a carbon chatas? What did they want? They wanted to feel, they wanted to harness the incredible power of cathartic change, of atonement, of tshuva. See, I will say, there is no greater energy in this world than the power of tshuva. And the Gemara says, Makom shebali tshuva omdim, ein sadikim gimurim omdim. The place that a Baal tshuva stands in, the holiness that a Baal Tshuva is able to acquire, the greatness, the new start that a Baal Tshuva has, even the greatest of tzaddikim can't have that. Rabbi said the Chasidim Harishonim, they wanted that. They wanted that. They're both saying, do you know how lucky we are that we're sinners? I'm not looking at anyone in particular, but we're so lucky. I feel so fortunate that I commit averos. I'm so happy. I'm so excited. You know why I'm so excited? Because I can do tshuva. Because I can do tshuva. And now that I know that I can do tshuva, Rabosai, that means I can get a new start. That means I can receive atonement. That means that I can harness the power that tzaddikim gimurim cannot. I could do something that the Gadol Hadar cannot do. I could do something that great tzaddikim can't do. I have a koach that the Chasidim Harishonim, they yearned for it. They pined for it. Baruch Hashem, I'm a sinner. I get to go ahead and do tshuva each and every day. And we'll say, that's the koach we have. Something that Chasidim Harishonim yearned, that they had to become a nazir. They had to become a nazir in order to do it. Me, all I have to do is get my act together. All I have to do is say I'm sorry. All I have to do is go through the steps of the Rambam's Hilchos Tshuva, and I could harness the greatest power which exists in this entire universe. Incredible. Amar Abaye, Shimon HaTzadik, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Lazar HaKavar, Kulon Shita Achos Hein. So Abaye says that Rabbi Omer, V'chiper alav me'asher chata ala nefesh. They will atone for him from the fact that he sinned regarding the nefesh, regarding the soul. Now, I will say, so, all right, let's see. V'chibe ezo chet, v'chibe ezo nefesh chata zeh. Now, I will say, the pasuk is by Nazir. Now, we're actually going to see, the pasuk is actually stated by the Nazir who becomes Tameh, so we'll have to circle back about that. But Lamaisa, the Gemara says, why are you calling the Nazir a chote? Why are you calling him a sinner? The Gemara says, listen to this. Ella shetzir atzmo min hayayin. Why is he a sinner? Because he literally, again, afflicted himself by abstaining from wine. There's a lot of wisdom in Chazal. Right? He afflicted himself by abstaining from wine. So the Gemara says, well, what's going on over here? Follow dvarim kavachomer. This is kavachomer. What's kavachomer? Umazeh shelo tzir atzmo ela min hayayin nikra chote. If this guy who abstains from wine is called a sinner, so what's the halacha? Hamitzar atzmo mikol davar al achas kama v'kama. One who goes ahead and unnecessarily afflicts himself by abstaining from other things is certainly called a sinner. I both say, this is one of the most beautiful Gemaras, because what is the Gemara conveying to us? HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not want us to be an ascetic nation. The Ribono Shel Olam created a beautiful world for us to enjoy it. That's why he created things, right? Why is the world so beautiful? Why are there so many beautiful material pleasures and enjoyment? Why? It's for everyone else, right? Jews should be miserable and the rest of humanity should be happy. As HaKadosh Baruch Hu created, he created everything in the world was created for Klal Yisrael. So he created the world for us to enjoy. Of course, to enjoy responsibly, for us to enjoy in moderation, for us to enjoy bikdusha ubitara. So listen to this. Rabbi Lazar HaKavar comes along and says, Nazir, why are you abstaining from wine? Why are you abstaining from wine? Why? I will say, by the way, I'll point out something very interesting. A Nazir also abstains from something else, which is going to a levaya. Going to a levaya, going to a cemetery, participating in a funeral is a chesed shel emes. That's not what the Nazir is held accountable for. Isn't it incredible? The Nazir is called the sinner because he unnecessarily abstains from the physical material. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says like this, I made enough stuff usher. You don't have to add on to the list. And this is incredibly important also because sometimes the trend is like chumras, right? Astringencies is what's the other word for chumras? Stringencies? Yeah, stringencies, right? Stringencies. Now, both say chumras have their place. Chumras absolutely have their place. There is a need for stringencies in order to go ahead and create a protective barrier around halacha, but not stringencies upon stringencies, and not unnecessary things that make Judaism onerous and difficult and overwhelming. Hashem wants, the Torah is pleasant, halacha is pleasant, to be a Jew is pleasant, and if it's unpleasant, chances are I'm doing something wrong. So Hashem says to the Nazir, why are you prohibiting something that is permitted? I'm God, I'll make the laws, I'll tell you what's permitted, I'll tell you what's prohibited, I'll give Chazal the power to make prohibited permitted, but that's it. We don't need every single person going ahead and adding on additional layers of prohibition. So he's held accountable. He's called a chote. So the Gemara says, if you're called a sinner for abstaining from wine, then all the more so a person who unnecessarily abstains from other things in life is certainly called a sinner as well. So the Gemara says, Mikan, this is incredible. Mikan, from here we learn, Kala Yoshev Betainis Nikra Chote. Whoever goes ahead and literally Fast unnecessarily. Yoshe b'tainis. Fast unnecessarily is called a sin. It's called a sinner. Sorry. The Gemara says, because again, the one who's constantly fasting is also abstaining unnecessarily from HaKadosh Baruch Hu's beautiful world, which He wants us to enjoy. So the Gemara says, 1 second. So all of this is based on the fact that the pasuk calls the Nazir a sinner. But as I just mentioned before, v'hadein kra b'Nazir tamei ksiv. But 1 second, the Torah doesn't call Stam a Nazir a sinner. It's talking, who's the sinner? Who's the sinner? The Nazir who becomes tamei. That's the. So again, and I will say, you could say, why is he called a sinner? Because the Torah is putting a little bit of blame at his feet, saying, listen, you should have been a little bit more careful, should have been a little bit more vigilant. But maybe it's not calling Stam a Nazir achote, mishum deshana b'chetu. No, that guy is a double sinner. Why is he a double sinner? Number one, you shouldn't have become a Nazir to begin with, right? In other words, why'd you do this? Why are you abstaining from stuff that's permitted? That's number one. And number two, after your Neder Nazirs, at least be careful. At least be vigilant. So you weren't even careful or vigilant. He's called a double sinner. So I will say, a fundamental machlokes, fundamentally yesodistic machlokes, about the nature of Nazirus, right, is becoming a Nazir an act of personal, or I will call it of extreme piety, in order to right one's personalistic way, or is an act of Nazirus considered to be an inappropriate act of religious zealotry? And this is a fundamental machlokes, a fundamental dispute, which I will say we're going to see follows us into Nazirus as well. We're in Mesechus Nazir as well. We're going to see this. And all of it, what's the machlokes based on? There's one thing that is clear, which is Nazir represents a level of extreme behavior. So the shaila is there ever room for extreme behavior for a Jew to right himself or not? That's the fundamental machlokes. I'll just tell you on this phrase, it's actually very striking. Hayoshev b'tainis nikra chote. So again, we translate it as one who literally sits in fasting, which means one who's constantly fasting, right, is called a sinner. Because again, based on the theme of the Gemara, you're unnecessarily depriving yourself of physical things which HaKadosh Baruch Hu said are permitted. So I saw brought down in the Sfarim a beautiful idea. Namely, I will say, if you look at the shoresh, if you look at the root of the word tainus, the shoresh is ayin nun hey. Ayin nun hey, ana, means affliction. So listen to this idea. What does it mean, hayoshev b'tainus? See, Rabbi say, everyone in life has moments of inui, of ana. Everyone has difficult moments. We all, right? Everyone has challenges. The only shaila is how acute or how difficult the challenges may be. But each and every one of us have these challenges. The whole key to successful living is you can't lose yourself in your challenges. You have to find a way to kind of pull it together, lick my wounds, get it together and move forward. Now the challenges may still be there and the challenges may be acute, they may be overwhelming, but I cannot let them paralyze me. I cannot let them sideline me in life. That's what the Gemara is saying. Hayoshev b'tainis. Rabbi said, what does it mean to be Yoshev? What does it mean to sit? To sit means you're immobile. To sit means I'm remaining in place. To sit means I'm no longer a holich. I'm no longer moving. I'm remaining in place. Hayoshev b'tainis. Rabbi said, what's a Yoshev b'tainis? It's someone who just sits in his troubles, sits in his afflictions, becomes paralyzed because of the enormity of his sorrow. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. I can't grow. I can't move. I'm Yoshev b'tainis. What happens, Rabbi say, if you allow your circumstances to immobilize and paralyze you? Nikra chote. That's called a sinner. Sometimes the greatest sin we commit is not one of the averos. Sometimes the greatest sin we commit is an inability to move forward with our challenges. Sometimes you can't move past your challenges, but you at least have to figure out a way to move with your challenges. Hayoshev b'tainis. If you wallow in your difficulties, you wallow in your misery, you just simply become immobilized or paralyzed because of your challenges, that's called a chote. That's called a sinner. A yid, a Jew, has to figure out how to take all of my challenges, how to take all of my difficulties, all of my adversity, stop sitting, and figure out a way to start moving. Incredible. Bosai Mishnah. Homer lechaver. I told you, good Gemara today. Homer lechavero. Homer konam konach kones. So we'll say, great. Now we'll say pretty much we finished the sugya of yados. I mean, not really. We're still going to come back to yados. We're only 10 blocks into Mesechus Nedarim. Hey, but we've at least gotten a little bit of a panoramic view of the concept of a yad. Right? Good. Now, we're moving on to kinui. Kinui means what? Right? Similar terms, which means, so there are certain explicit ways to go ahead and make a neder, and then there's what we'll call similar terms or similar verbiage in order to go ahead and affect a neder. So we're going to give you some examples of this. So Omer, for example, konam, konach, kones, hare'elu kinui in the carbon. We'll say all of these lashonos are a kinui for carbon. So if you use any of these lashonos, so look at Rashi for just a moment. Omar konam kikar ze'alai. Just to give you an example, the usage, right? How is it used in a sentence, right? So if you were to go ahead and say konam kikar zu'alai, right? This loaf should be konam, or for that matter, again, it's konam, konach, kones. If you say this loaf should be konach, konam, koses on me, so ultimately, what does that do? That makes it usher to you like a carbon, right? That ultimately consecrates it like a carbon. Okay, so these are kinuyim for a carbon. Cherek, cheref, charaf. Sorry, cherek, charach, cheref. Hare'elu kinuyim lecherem. Rabbi say these are all kinui, right? These are all similar terms for ultimately cherem. Rabbi say we're going to talk about in the world of cherem. There's also different types of cherem. There could be cherem that you're giving something to the Beis Hamikdash. There could be cherem that you're giving something to the Kohanim. But these are all kinuyim. These are all similar terms that ultimately go ahead and make something into a cherem. Furthermore, nozik, naziach, paziach, hare'elu kinuyim lenazirus. If you use any of these lashonos, right? So I will say again, these are all similar terms, similar or equivalent terms, ultimately to become a nazir. We'll say if you used any of these terms, that's undertaking a neder naziros. Okay, shavusa shekuka, no derbe mohi, hare'elu kinuyim l'shavua. Interesting one. We'll say if you use lashon of shavusa, shavuka, or I take a neder by mohi. Who mohi is, we'll have to see. These are all kinuyim. These are all kinuyim for a shvua, right? In order to go ahead and take an oath. Okay, so we'll say so now we've been introduced Baruch Hashem to the world of kinuyim. We'll say, by the way, if you just take a quick look at the Ran, we see what the Ran says. Neder b'mohi. It's about 15 lines up from the bottom. Neder b'mohi or elu kinuyim l'shvua. So the Ran gives us a little bit of coming attractions. B'mohi kinui l'moshe. So we're going to see mohi is actually a kinui, is actually a similar term to Moshe. To Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Gemara says, "LaMoshe b'shvuas Moshe kedichsiv vayoel Moshe." We'll see again. It makes reference ultimately again to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu adjured the nation. He adjured the nation, right? He put them under oath. So therefore, again, neder b'mohi is a kinui for taking a shor, essentially by the oath of Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, good. We'll see in the Gemara. Itmar. So we'll say, let's analyze. We've actually seen this before. Itmar kinuyin. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Lashon Umosein. Rabbi Shmuel Lakish Omer Lashon Shabadul Chachem Lios Noderbo. We'll see. Here we go. Fascinating machlokes. We have actually seen this before. We saw this already in the first Gemara. What is a kinui? What is a kinui? Rabbi Yochanan says kinui are just simply foreign terms. They're foreign terms, so they're terms used by other nations. Also, again, that are related to vowing. They're related to vowing, and therefore, again, we accept them as valid formulations for accepting a neder upon oneself. Rav Shimon Lakish says, no. Lashon shebadulem chacham lios noder. They're actually not foreign terms. Instead, what are they? They're rabbinically constructed terms. These are different terms, right, that are similar in some way to the actual term of a neder. And Chazal said, if you use these variations, it works. Fundamental machlokes. V'cheinu omer b'chodesh asher bada milibo. So this is interesting. Rish Lakish quotes the pasuk over here from Melachim, and the lashon of bada means something that you invent. That you invent. Okay. So the Gemara says, "V'tayma ma'takin rabbanan kinuyin." So I'll say, so according to the approach of Rish Lakish. So I'll say, according to Rabbi Yochanan, I understand. A kinui means essentially is a foreign language, and Chazal allow me to use an equivalent term in a foreign language in order to affect the neder. But according to Rish Lakish, Chazal are inventing words. Why are Chazal inventing words? Why is that? Why is that necessary? So also is incredible. The lolema carbon, because Chazal did not want me to say the word carbon. In other words, so instead of saying carbon, Chazal invented a word called konam. And once they invented the word konam, other forms of konam, konach, kones also work. Like it says, I understand. What's wrong with saying carbon? The lema carbon. What's wrong with saying the word carbon? No, you're right. So the Gemara says, Dilma Omer carbon la Hashem. The concern is not that you're going to say carbon. The concern is that what? You're going to say a carbon to Hashem. Says the Gemara, okay, still don't see the problem. V'leimo carbon LaHashem. Why can't you just say carbon LaHashem? Dilma Amar LaHashem v'lo Amar carbon. V'kamapik Shem Shemayim levatala. Oh, so listen to this. So the Gemara says, because we don't want you to say carbon. Why can't you say carbon? We don't want you to say carbon LaHashem. Why can't you say carbon LaHashem? No, what are we worried about? That you're going to say LaHashem carbon. So what's wrong with LaHashem carbon? We're worried that you're going to say LaHashem and you're not going to finish the sentence. And if you say the name of Hashem and you don't finish the sentence, what have you effectively done? You've gone ahead and used the name of Hashem in vain. The Tanya we learned Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, Yud Amud Beis, Yud Amud Beis. Minayin shlo yomar adam LaHashem ola, LaHashem mincha, LaHashem toda, LaHashem shlamim. Rabbi say, how do you know that halacha l'maisa, when consecrating a carbon, you should not say for Hashem and Ola, for Hashem Mincha, for Hashem Atoda, for Hashem Ashlamim. Rabbi say instead, what should you say? What should you say? You should reverse the order. How do you know that? Talmud Lomar, Karban LaHashem. Rabbi say the way the Torah phrases the concept of bringing a carbon is bringing a carbon LaHashem. Rabbi say, why a carbon LaHashem? Ultimately, again, because we don't want you using the name of God as the first part of the carbonic articulation. What are we concerned about? Or carbonic designation. What are we concerned about? You're going to say the name of Hashem and then what? Look, a squirrel, right? You're going to get distracted, right? Or you're going to forget, or you're going to change your mind, right? Or something's going to happen. And what's the problem? Although you started with all the right intentions, at the end of the day, I didn't finish the sentence. And so it turns out that I've used the name of Hashem levatala. So Chazal were concerned about this. Chazal were so concerned about this that what? That they even came up with a new vocabulary. Konam, konach, kones. Just say that. Just say that. Rabbi said, by the way, you don't have to use the name of Hashem at all. And this is the approved rabbinic list of carbonic equivalent terms. Say that, you've made a neder. You don't even have to use the name of Hashem. Beautiful. To which the Gemara says, "V'kav v'chomer." Rabbi said, "This is incredible." Uma zesh lo niskavin ela haskir shem shamayim ala carbon. Rabbi say, let's analyze this. This wouldn't even be a use of the name of Hashem levatala. Right? Rabbi said, let's play this out for just a moment. Let's say you said your intention was to say la Hashem carbon, right? You say la Hashem, then again, look a squirrel. You forgot about everything you were doing. Then what happens? Rabbi say, that's not even called Shem Hashem levatala. Why not? Why not? Because when you articulated the name of Hashem, you had explicit intent for why you're doing it, carbonic designation. So that's not really even called levatala. Yet you see, Rabbi say, Chazal are going to great lengths to ensure that doesn't even happen. So if that's the case, Rabbi say, so the Gemara says, Amar Torah carbon la Hashem levatala al achas kama v'kama. Rabbi say, now we begin to see how egregious it is to use the name of Hashem in a levatala, in an unnecessary way. So if Chazal were so concerned about carbon la Hashem as opposed to la Hashem carbon, where Rabbi say even if a mistake is made, it wouldn't be an egregious mistake. It wouldn't be a kavanah mistake. It would just be a mistake that started with good intentions. Alachas kama v'kama, when a person uses the name of Hashem, ultimately levatala, chas v'shalom, in a vain or in vain, chas v'shalom, how terrible that is. Incredible. So we'll say, by the way, I think I mentioned, I don't remember what the context was. The Rambam actually paskins that when one makes a bracha levatala, when one makes an unnecessary bracha, ultimately, again, that is violation of the second of the 10 commandments of lo sisa shema Hashem elokecha l'shav, not taking Hashem's name in vain. The Rebbe says it's very serious because a lot of times, even throughout the day, not intentionally, I make a bracha levatala. Right? The Rebbe says, sometimes one of the hardest things we encounter for many of us is making brachos with kavanah. Right? So what happens? It happens all the time. I'm drinking my cup of coffee. I made a bracha, shakol niyah, and then what happens? I made it with absolutely zero kavanah. So because I made it with zero kavanah, often 6 minutes later, I don't even remember that I made the bracha. So what do I end up doing? I end up making another bracha. The bracha said that's a bracha levatala. That's a bracha levatala. That is an unnecessary bracha. And according to the Rambam, I've just taken Hashem's name in vain. I've just violated the second of the 10 commandments. And the Gemara says, that's serious stuff. I don't even mean from a punitive perspective, but it's just serious to take Hashem's name in vain. So again, a good mussar for us also about being a bit more attentive when we make brachos. Good, fine, let's go back to Kitanoi. So Rabbi say, let's analyze this. Maybe this whole thing is a machlokes tanoim. Rabbi say, now what's a machlokes tanoim? So Rabbi say, remember again, now we have a fundamental machlokes about the concept of a kinui, right? So machlokes, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says, kinuyim are lashon umos, foreign language equivalents. Reish Lakish says, no, kinuyim are rabbinically invented formulations. So Gemara says, say this is a machlokes. Here we go. Beis Shammai Omrim is so fascinating. Beis Shammai Omrim, kinuyin asurin. Rabbi says, listen to this. What happens if you have a kinui of a kinui? Right, let's say you take a kinui, and now you have a similar term for a kinui. So you have a kinui of a kinui. Does that work to affect an neder? Beis Shammai says, yes. We'll say asurin means that a kinui of a kinui has the ability to affect a neder. Beis Hillel omrim kinui mitar. Beis Hillel says, no, doesn't work, right? Doesn't work. Look at Rashi for just a moment, by the way, on the left-hand side. Kinui asurin. Shem nadar bekinui kinuyin. The kasavar kinui. So good, fine, let's go outside. So Beis Hillel says, no, it doesn't work. So my love, so let's analyze this. What's at the core of their machlokes? My love, man da'amar kinuyin asurin. The opinion that holds that the kinui of a kinui works to affect an neder, i.e. Beis Shammai, they must hold kinuye lashon umosein. That kinuyim are real words. And just like a kinui is a real word, so too what? Kinuyim is also a real word. They're foreign language words, and therefore again it'll work. And what happens? Kasavar can make it lashon umosein. Ulamandra mutarin, but according to the opinion, i.e. Beis Hillel, who says that kinuyin does not work or do not work. Kasavar lashon shebadu lahen chachamim. They must hold or say that a kinui in general is a rabbinically invented formulation, and therefore what? It was only the specifically invented formulations that work. But a formulation of the formulation is not going to work because Chazal never sanctioned that. Shabbos say must be the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is the same machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Beautiful. To which the Gemara says, no. In fact, everyone agrees with Rabbi Yochanan. That halacha l'maisa, a kinui is lashon umos, is actually a foreign language equivalent. The Gemara says, so what does Beis Shammai hold? Beis Shammai savri bahani nami mishtay umos. So Beis Shammai will say that why are kinuyim good? Why does it work? Because the umos ha'olam use these words as well. They use these just like the umos ha'olam use kinuyim. They also use these kinuyim to work. Beis Hillel savri bahani lo mishtay umos. Beis Hillel says no, it's not true. In other words, kinuyim are foreign language equivalents that are used by the nations of the world. But the nations of the world do not use these kinuyim. We'll say are just a variation, some invented variation. But no one uses these words. So in fact, what's quite fascinating over here is, according to this approach, everyone agrees with Rabbi Yochanan. Namely, a kinui is lashon umos, is a foreign language equivalent. And ultimately, again, the machlokes over here is, are there kinuyim, right? Are there foreign language equivalents that are kinuyim? It's a machlokes and metzius. Beis Shammai says yes, Beis Hillel says no. Another possibility is, Beis Shammai savri gazrinan kinuyin mishum kinuyin. It could very well be that there's another machlokes, there's some machlokes, still going with the idea that kinuyim are lashon umos, are foreign language equivalents. And let's assume right now for a moment that everyone maybe even agrees that kinuyim are not used by the nations of the world. So why would Beis Shammai say that they work? Beis Shammai savri gazri kinuyin mishum kinuyin. Ultimately, again, we're going to allow kinuyim to work in order to go ahead and safeguard the use of kinuyim. That we're afraid if we don't allow kinuyim to work, then people will assume a kinui doesn't work as well. Beis Hillel savri lo gazrinan kinuyim mishum kinuyim. And Beis Hillel doesn't agree to that. Beis Hillel says no, kinuyim work. Kinuyim ultimately again do not work. So now we're introduced to our first fundamental machlokes by kinuyim. What is a kinui? Machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan telling me a kinui is lashon umos, is a foreign language equivalent. Ultimately again Reish Lakish telling me that halacha l'maisa, It is not, rather, again, it is a rabbinically invented equivalent. I will say, the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yochanan, namely that, again, a kinui is Lashon Umos. Kinui is Lashon Umos. That Allah Chalamais, again, it's a foreign language equivalent. And I will say, ultimately, because of that, we also paskin like Beis Hillel. Therefore, it's only a kinui that works, but kinuyim ultimately will not work. Let's go a little bit weiter. Says the Gemara, Nedarim. So just we're going through a list. So we'll say, give me some examples of a kinui of a kinui. Kinuyim, right? So listen to this by Nedarim. What are some examples? Tani Rav Yosef, Mikanamna, Mikanachna, Mikanasna. I suppose these were just equivalent, right? These were kinuyim on the kinuyim, right? Kinuyim on the kinuyim. Hechidami kinuyim de cherem. What's the example of kinuyim by cherem? So here we go. Tani mefasha. So we'll say mefasha is someone's name. That's not a kinuyim, right? That's a guy, right? So mefasha says charachim. Okay. Kinuyim de nezirus. What's the example of kinuyim by nezirus? Tani Rav Yosef mechazakna, menazachna, mafichna. So you've got fine. Ibai leho. Mifachazna mai, mischazna mai, misazna mai. What about these other terms? What do they do? So Amar Ravina Ravashi, kinma mai. So we'll say, what about kinma? So then we'll say now that we've opened the door to kinuyim, we're bringing in these unconventional terms. What do they do? Say kinma mai. Rabbi is interesting. Focusing on this last one, mai. Konim ka'amar. Rabbi is kinma a kinui de kinuyim. Is this like a kinui on konam? Just like konam gives something carbonic status. Does kinma also go ahead and give something carbonic status? Odilma, kinman bosem ka'amar. I will say maybe kinma is a lashon of fragrant cinnamon. Okay, so like pretty big disparity over here. Am I calling something a carbon, or ultimately am I calling it fragrant cinnamon? Ravashi, kina mai. Soon as we'll say a person uses the lashon of kina. What is kina? Is kina a kinuyim for konam, or my kina shall turn to golim? Amar, we'll say kina can mean like a chicken coop, right? Doesn't referring to a chicken coop? O dilma lashon to konam, or is it a lashon of konam? To which the Gemara says tibai. Tibai, we'll remember again is what is the nazir equivalent ultimately of tegu. So remember, for our purposes, these questions are a little bit academic for the reason that we paskin like Beis Hillel that kinuyim doesn't work. Kinuyim doesn't work. So Lamaisa, therefore, again, only the articulated ideas that are found in the Umos HaOlam, but the kinuyim ultimately will not work. Okay, incredible. So the Gemara says the following: kinuyim de shvua hechidami. We'll say, what's the case? We'll say, we'll stop over here for today. Sorry, we didn't finish up to the Mishnah. It's okay. Tomorrow's a little bit of a much shorter daf. We'll say, shkoyach, what a way to end the week. What beautiful, incredible Gemara. I will say, shkoyach, for another great week. Meretz Hashem to be continued on Shabbos. Shkoyach, everyone. All right, Chevron Zoom. Good to see you, everyone. Reb Jerry, looking forward to seeing you, Meretz Hashem, next week. Richard, looking to see you next week, Meretz Hashem. Forward to seeing everyone next week. Shavua haba, Nedarim will be in Yerushalayim. Meretz Hashem. All right, good Shabbos, everyone. Shkoyach.